In 1987, a nurse walked into the basement of Ridgewood Memorial Hospital to retrieve medical supplies. She never came back up. Search teams found her 72 hours later, sitting in a corner of a room that did not appear on any blueprint. She was alive. Her heart was beating. Her eyes were open. But the woman they carried out of that basement was not the same woman who had walked in. She never spoke again. She never blinked again. And every night until her death 11 years later, she would draw the same image over and over. A door, a long hallway, and something standing at the end of it waiting. Ridgewood Memorial Hospital has been abandoned for 36 years. It sits on 14 acres of overgrown land in a small town that most maps do not bother to include. The windows are boarded. The entrances are sealed with concrete. A 12-foot fence topped with razor wire surrounds the entire property. Signs posted every 30 feet warn of prosecution, contamination, and structural collapse. But none of those warnings tell the truth. None of them explain why the town spent $3 million sealing a building they could have demolished for a fraction of the cost. None of them explain why armed security patrols the perimeter every night. And none of them explain why, according to sealed court records I obtained last month, 17 people have attempted to enter Ridgewood Memorial since its closure. 14 of those people were never seen again. The other 3 were found. What remained of their minds was not worth saving. Tonight I am going to tell you what happened inside Ridgewood Memorial Hospital. I am going to tell you why it was really closed, what was discovered in its basement, and why the government has spent 3 decades ensuring that no one ever sets foot inside again. This is not speculation. This is not urban legend. This is documented fact, assembled from police reports, medical records, witness testimony, and classified files that were never meant to see the light of day. I need to warn you before we go further. What I am about to share contains no graphic violence, no gore, no shock imagery. It does not need any of that. The truth about Ridgewood Memorial is far more disturbing than anything Hollywood could fabricate. It is the kind of truth that settles into your mind and refuses to leave. The kind that makes you listen more carefully to the silence in your home. The kind that makes you wonder, as you drift off to sleep tonight, whether the door to your bedroom is truly closed, or whether something has been standing in your doorway for hours, patient and still, waiting for you to notice. Ridgewood Memorial Hospital opened in 1931. It was built to serve a growing community, a symbol of progress and modern medicine in a region that had previously relied on distant city hospitals for serious care. The main building was 5 stories tall, constructed from red brick that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. The basement level, which extended beneath the entire footprint of the structure, housed mechanical systems, storage facilities, and a small morgue. For its first 4 decades, Ridgewood Memorial was everything the community had hoped for. Bobbies were born there. Lives were saved there. Families gathered in waiting rooms, praying for good news, often receiving it. But something changed in the early 1970s. The hospital's records from this period are incomplete, large sections missing or redacted, but what remains tells a troubling story. Patient complaints began increasing dramatically. People reported strange experiences during overnight stays. They heard footsteps in empty hallways. They saw figures standing in doorways that vanished when nurses arrived. They woke from surgery with memories of conversations that their doctors swore never happened. Conversations with people who had died on operating tables years before. The staff noticed changes too. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Medications disappeared from locked cabinets. Certain rooms developed a coldness that no amount of heating could dispel. And then there was Ward 7, the psychiatric wing on the 4th floor. The place where the most disturbed patients were housed. The place where, according to a night shift orderly who later testified in a sealed deposition, the walls themselves began to whisper. Ward 7 was closed in 1974 following an incident that hospital administrators refused to document officially. What we know comes from interviews conducted decades later with staff members who had long since retired. They described a night when every patient in Ward 7 began screaming simultaneously at exactly 3:47 in the morning. Not random screaming, not the varied cries of individual distress. Every patient, all 23 of them, screamed the same words in perfect unison. They screamed a name that none of them should have known, a name that belonged to a doctor who had worked at Ridgewood Memorial in 1943, who had died in the basement under circumstances that were never properly investigated, and whose body was never found. The doctor's name was Harold Crane. He had worked at Ridgewood Memorial for 11 years, serving as the chief of internal medicine, beloved by patients and respected by colleagues. On the night of February 3, 1943, Harold Crane descended into the basement to investigate a noise complaint from the night staff. They had reported hearing what sounded like digging beneath the morgue floor. Rhythmic, persistent digging, as if someone was trying to claw their way up from beneath the concrete foundation. Harold dismissed their concerns as imagination amplified by wartime anxiety. He went down alone, carrying only a flashlight and his characteristic confidence. The staff heard his footsteps descending the stairs. They heard the basement door close behind him. They never heard anything else. When Harold failed to return after 2 hours, orderlies were sent to find him. The basement was empty. Every room was checked. Every storage closet was opened. Every corner was illuminated. Harold Crane had vanished from a sealed basement with no exterior exits, no windows, and only one staircase leading up to the main floor. His flashlight was found on the morgue floor, still switched on, pointing at the far wall. The battery should have lasted another 6 hours. But when the orderlies picked it up, it was ice cold, as if it had been sitting in a freezer rather than a room-temperature basement. The official explanation was that Harold had suffered some kind of mental break, had somehow exited the building without being seen, and had wandered off into the night. A search of the surrounding area found nothing. No body, no clothing, no evidence that Harold Crane had ever left the hospital at all. His family was notified. A memorial service was held. The basement morgue was quietly locked, with staff instructed to use an alternative storage facility in the East Wing. And for 31 years, Ridgewood Memorial pretended that nothing had happened beneath its floors. But the hospital remembered. That is the only way I can describe what happened over the following decades. The building itself seemed to remember Harold Crane, and it wanted everyone inside to remember him too. Patients who had never heard of Harold began describing him in their sleep. They spoke of a tall man in a white coat who visited them at night, who stood at the foot of their beds, who asked them questions they could not remember upon waking. Nurses reported seeing a figure in outdated medical attire walking the corridors after midnight, always moving toward the basement stairs, always disappearing before anyone could get close enough to identify him. Security cameras installed in the 1960s captured footage that administrators refused to release. Footage that showed empty hallways where footprints appeared in dust that no one had disturbed, where doors opened and closed without any visible cause, where shadows moved in directions that contradicted the available light sources. And then there were the sounds from beneath the floor. The digging that Harold Crane had gone to investigate never stopped. Staff members working night shifts reported hearing it throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Always the same rhythm, always coming from beneath the morgue, always accompanied by a cold draft that seemed to seep up through the floor itself, carrying with it a smell that longtime employees recognized from their worst professional memories. The smell of bodies, not fresh death, but something older. Something that had been waiting in darkness for a very long time. In 1976, hospital administrators made a decision that would seal Ridgewood Memorial's fate. They hired a construction crew to excavate beneath the morgue floor. The official reason was infrastructure improvement. A need to inspect foundations and update plumbing that had not been serviced since the building's construction. But internal memos tell a different story. The administrators wanted to know what was making those sounds. They wanted to find Harold Crane, or whatever remained of him. They wanted answers that 43 years of silence had failed to provide. The excavation began on a Monday morning in September. A crew of 6 workers broke through the concrete floor of the morgue, revealing packed earth beneath that should not have existed. The original building plans showed solid bedrock at that depth. Instead, the workers found soil that was soft, dark, and disturbingly warm. They dug for 3 days, removing tons of earth that seemed to regenerate overnight, filling portions of the excavation that had been empty when they left the previous evening. The foreman documented these anomalies in his work log, noting that he had never encountered anything like it in 25 years of construction work. He also noted that his crew was becoming increasingly agitated, that they were hearing whispers in the soil, that 2 workers had quit without explanation after their first day underground. On Thursday afternoon, the remaining crew broke through into a cavity beneath the morgue. The cavity was not natural. Its walls were too smooth, too regular, too deliberate. Someone had carved this space out of the earth beneath Ridgewood Memorial, creating a chamber approximately 30 feet in diameter with a ceiling just high enough to stand in. The chamber was empty except for 3 things: a wooden chair positioned in the exact center, a mirror mounted on the far wall, its surface somehow untarnished despite decades underground, and words carved into every inch of the surrounding walls, covering the stone from floor to ceiling in handwriting that one worker recognized from hospital records he had seen in the administrator's office. The handwriting belonged to Harold Crane. The words carved into those walls have never been fully transcribed. The workers who descended into the chamber photographed sections of the text before they fled, and those photographs eventually made their way into the files I obtained. What I can tell you is that the carvings were not random. They were organized, systematic, covering the walls in a spiral pattern that started at the floor and wound upward toward the ceiling. They appeared to be instructions. Instructions for something that Harold Crane had either discovered or created during the missing hours before his disappearance. Instructions that referenced dates, coordinates, and names. Names of people who would not be born for decades. Names of patients who would one day check into Ridgewood Memorial and never check out. The construction crew evacuated the chamber within 15 minutes of entering it. They sealed the excavation with fresh concrete that same night, working under floodlights, refusing to stop until every trace of that underground room was buried once again. 2 workers resigned the next morning. One suffered a complete psychological breakdown and was committed to a facility in another state. The foreman submitted his final report, collected his payment, and was never heard from again. Hospital records indicate he moved to a different country, but immigration records show no departure under his name. Like Harold Crane before him, he simply vanished. Ridgewood Memorial continued operating for another 11 years after the chamber was sealed, but the hospital was never the same. Whatever the construction crew had disturbed beneath the morgue floor did not return to dormancy. It became more active, more visible, more hungry. The incidents accelerated throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Patients began disappearing from their rooms, not dying, not discharging themselves against medical advice, simply vanishing between nurse check-ins, leaving behind beds that were still warm, personal belongings that were never collected, and families who demanded answers that the hospital could not provide. 11 patients disappeared between 1976 and 1982. Police investigations produced nothing. Search parties found nothing. The hospital paid settlements to grieving families and implemented security measures that proved utterly useless. Because the disappearances were not random, I discovered this pattern only after obtaining access to records that were supposed to have been destroyed. Every missing patient had stayed in the same room at some point during their hospitalization. Room 147, a private room on the ground floor, located directly above the sealed chamber. A room that nurses had been quietly refusing to enter alone for years. Room 147 was unremarkable in every physical sense. standard hospital furniture, standard medical equipment, a window overlooking the parking lot, a bathroom with functioning plumbing. Nothing about its construction explained why patients assigned to that room experienced phenomena that they struggled to describe to staff members who did not want to hear. They reported waking to find themselves standing in corners they did not remember walking to. They reported conversations with visitors who signed in at reception, but left no record in the hospital's security footage. They reported dreams of descending through the floor, passing through concrete and soil and stone, arriving in a circular chamber where a figure in a white coat asked them questions they could not remember upon waking. And they reported the mirror, always the mirror. Patients in room 147 claimed that the mirror above the bathroom sink showed them things that were not in the room, figures standing behind them when they were alone, shadows moving across surfaces where no shadows should exist, and sometimes, in the late hours of the night, their own reflections would stop copying their movements. Their reflections would turn their heads slowly, deliberately, and look at something that the patients themselves could not see. Something standing just outside the frame of the mirror, something waiting to be acknowledged. The hospital's solution to room 147 was characteristically inadequate. They removed the mirror, replacing it with a simple sheet of polished metal that provided a reflection without the unsettling clarity of glass. This accomplished nothing. Patients continued experiencing phenomena. Patients continued disappearing. And the polished metal, according to maintenance records, had to be replaced 7 times in 3 years because it kept developing a dark stain in its center. A stain that spread outward each night and receded each morning. A stain that one maintenance worker described as looking like someone pressing their face against the other side, trying to push through. I need to tell you about the night that Ridgewood Memorial died. The night that sealed the hospital's fate and ensured that no one would ever practice medicine within its walls again. November 15, 1987, a Sunday night, skeleton crews staffing the building, 43 patients distributed across 4 floors, most of them sleeping, a few receiving end-of-life care that required round-the-clock monitoring. The weather was unremarkable. The moon was a thin crescent offering little light. The hospital had been operating normally, or what passed for normally in a building where staff members had learned to ignore footsteps in empty corridors and shadows that moved against the direction of light. At 3:47 in the morning, every light in Ridgewood Memorial went out simultaneously. Emergency generators that had been tested and certified 6 weeks earlier failed to activate. Backup battery systems that should have powered critical equipment remained dark. The hospital was plunged into absolute blackness, the kind of darkness that exists only in places where artificial light has been the sole illumination for decades, where human eyes have forgotten how to adjust to genuine night. Staff members activated flashlights and emergency protocols. Nurses began checking on patients, moving carefully through corridors that seemed longer than they should have been, passing doors that appeared in places where no doors had existed before. The head nurse on the 3rd floor, a woman named Patricia Vance who had worked at Ridgewood for 23 years, later described the experience in a statement that was sealed by court order but leaked to me by a sympathetic clerk who believed the public deserved to know. Patricia said the darkness was not natural. It resisted flashlight beams, absorbing light rather than yielding to it. She said the silence was worse. A hospital is never truly silent. Machines beep, patients breathe, HVAC systems hum. But in those first minutes after the blackout, Ridgewood Memorial became quieter than any occupied building should ever be. Patricia could not hear her own footsteps. She could not hear her colleagues moving through nearby corridors. She could not hear anything except a distant sound that she initially mistook for rushing water, but gradually recognized as something else entirely. Whispering, thousands of voices whispering at once, coming from beneath the floor, rising up through the building like heat from a fire. The whispers were saying something that Patricia could almost understand if she concentrated hard enough. something that pulled at her attention, drawing her toward the stairwell at the end of the corridor, something that wanted her to descend. Patricia did not descend. Her training overrode her curiosity, and she continued checking on patients, forcing herself to focus on protocol rather than the impossible sounds infiltrating her hospital. This decision saved her life. The same cannot be said for everyone who was in Ridgewood Memorial that night. When the lights returned at 4:47 in the morning, exactly 1 hour after they had failed, the hospital conducted an immediate census of all patients and staff. 43 patients had been in their beds when darkness fell. 37 remained. 6 patients had vanished from 6 different rooms, leaving behind warm sheets, half-finished water glasses, and personal items that their families would later collect from storage boxes that smelled faintly of earth and something older. But the patients were not the only ones missing. 3 staff members were unaccounted for. 2 orderlies who had been working the basement level, performing routine inventory checks in a storage facility located 1 floor above the sealed chamber, and a nurse named Linda Morrison, who had descended to the basement at approximately 3:30 in the morning to retrieve surgical supplies for an emergency procedure that never happened. The procedure was canceled when the patient died at 3:46, exactly 1 minute before the blackout began. Linda Morrison is the nurse I mentioned at the beginning of this account, the one who was found 72 hours later in a room that did not appear on any blueprint, the one who spent the rest of her life drawing a door, a hallway, and something waiting at the end. What I did not tell you is what the search team found in that impossible room alongside her. What I did not tell you is why the authorities sealed not just the room, not just the basement, but the entire hospital. The search team was composed of 4 men, 2 police officers, a hospital administrator, and a structural engineer who had been called in to assess whether the basement was safe to search after the blackout. They descended together, flashlights cutting through air that felt thicker than it should have, heavier, as if the atmosphere itself was reluctant to let them pass. The basement corridors were unchanged from their usual layout. Storage rooms, mechanical closets, the sealed morgue that no one had entered since 1976. Everything appeared normal until they reached the east wing of the basement, a section that blueprints indicated should contain nothing but a concrete wall. The wall was gone. In its place was a corridor that extended at least 40 feet into darkness, terminating at a door that none of them recognized. The corridor walls were smooth, seamless, constructed from a material that resembled concrete but absorbed their flashlight beams in a way that natural stone should not. There were no light fixtures, no ventilation grates, no indication that this passage had been designed for human use. And yet it was there, impossible and undeniable, leading somewhere that Ridgewood Memorial's original architects had never intended. The structural engineer refused to proceed. He stated that what they were looking at could not exist, that the space they were observing should be occupied by solid earth and the foundations of an adjacent building. He waited at the entrance while the others advanced. This decision haunted him for the remaining years of his life, not because he wished he had gone with them, but because of what he saw while standing alone at the threshold of that impossible corridor. He saw movement in the darkness beyond the door, shapes that shifted just outside his flashlight's reach, shapes that seemed aware of his presence, that adjusted their positions whenever he moved his light, that remained perpetually at the edge of visibility no matter how he angled his beam. The engineer stood there for approximately 15 minutes, watching those shapes, understanding on some primal level that they were watching him too. When the search team finally returned, carrying Linda Morrison between them, the engineer could not speak for several hours. He simply pointed at the corridor, at the darkness, at the shapes that had retreated when additional lights arrived but had not disappeared entirely. Linda Morrison was found sitting in a chair at the center of a circular room. The room matched descriptions of the chamber discovered beneath the morgue in 1976, the chamber that construction workers had sealed with fresh concrete and industrial determination. But this room was different. The walls were not covered in Harold Crane's handwritten instructions. They were covered in photographs. Thousands of photographs, attached to every surface from floor to ceiling, overlapping in places, creating a collage of faces that the search team recognized with mounting horror. The photographs showed patients. Current patients, former patients, patients who had died at Ridgewood Memorial, and patients who had vanished without explanation. Each photograph was labeled with a name, a date of admission, and a second date that the search team initially could not interpret. It was only later, during the investigation that followed, that authorities realized the second date was a death date, and many of those dates had not yet occurred. The photographs continued beyond the walls. They covered the ceiling. They covered the floor. They were arranged in a spiral pattern that drew the eye toward the center of the room, toward the chair where Linda Morrison sat motionless, toward a mirror mounted on a stand directly in front of her. The mirror was identical to the one that had been removed from room 147 years earlier. Its surface was pristine, reflecting the search team's flashlights with perfect clarity. But Linda Morrison's reflection was not sitting still. In the mirror, Linda was standing. In the mirror, Linda was facing a door that did not exist in the physical room. In the mirror, Linda was reaching for the handle of that door while something stood behind her, something tall and dressed in white, something that turned its head toward the search team as they entered, something that smiled with a mouth that contained no teeth, no tongue, no recognizable anatomy at all. The search team extracted Linda Morrison without looking at the mirror again. They carried her up through the basement, through the hospital, out into morning sunlight that felt weaker than it should have been. They handed her off to paramedics who rushed her to a facility in another county, a facility far away from Ridgewood Memorial and whatever waited in its depths. And then they returned to seal the corridor, to bury what they had found, to ensure that no one would ever stumble into that room again. But sealing the corridor was not enough. The hospital administrator who had participated in the search made a series of phone calls that morning, contacting people whose names do not appear in any public record, requesting assistance from agencies that officially have no jurisdiction over abandoned medical facilities. By noon, Ridgewood Memorial Hospital was evacuated. By sunset, the entrances were welded shut. By the following week, construction crews had arrived to seal every possible point of access with concrete, steel, and materials that I have been unable to identify despite extensive research. The official explanation was structural instability combined with environmental contamination, asbestos, lead paint, compromised foundations, the usual excuses that authorities deploy when they need to keep people away from places that cannot be safely explained. The local newspaper printed a brief article expressing disappointment that such a historic building could not be saved. The community accepted the loss and moved on. Within a year, most residents had stopped thinking about Ridgewood Memorial entirely. But the hospital did not stop thinking about them. In the months following the closure, residents living within a mile of Ridgewood Memorial began reporting strange experiences. Sounds at night that seemed to emanate from the direction of the abandoned hospital. Glimpses of lights moving behind boarded windows that should have contained only darkness. Dreams of corridors that descended forever, of doors that opened onto rooms full of photographs. Of a figure in white, who asked questions that the dreamers could never remember upon waking. And the photographs. I need to tell you about the photographs. Linda Morrison spent the final 11 years of her life in a psychiatric facility, never speaking, never blinking, drawing the same image over and over until her hands bled and nurses had to restrain her. But she was not the only one who emerged from that night with visions she could not escape. Every member of the search team experienced changes in the weeks and months that followed. The two police officers began seeing faces in reflective surfaces, faces that did not belong to anyone in the room. The hospital administrator developed an obsession with mirrors, covering every reflective surface in his home with cloth or paper, refusing to enter bathrooms unless the lights were off. And the structural engineer, the one who had waited at the corridor entrance while the others ventured inside, began receiving photographs in his mail. The photographs arrived without postmarks, without return addresses, without any indication of how they had entered the postal system. They appeared in the engineer's mailbox every morning for 6 consecutive months, each envelope containing a single image. The first photograph showed his childhood home. The second showed his parents on their wedding day. The third showed him as an infant, cradled in his mother's arms, in a hospital room he did not recognize. Each subsequent photograph moved forward through his life, documenting moments he remembered and moments he had forgotten, capturing angles that suggested the photographer had been standing impossibly close, invisibly close, watching him throughout his entire existence. The engineer tried to investigate. He contacted postal inspectors, hired private detectives, installed cameras on his mailbox that captured nothing except empty air and photographs that appeared between frames, materializing in the space between 1 second and the next. He moved 3 times, each time to a new city, each time hopping to escape whatever was documenting his life with such obsessive precision. The photographs followed him. They found him in apartments that he had rented under false names. They found him in hotel rooms where he had paid with cash. They found him everywhere because whatever was sending them did not need to know his address. It already knew everything else. The final photograph arrived on the morning of March 15, 1989. It showed the engineer standing in his kitchen, looking at the previous day's photograph. The timestamp in the corner indicated it had been taken at 3:47 in the morning. The engineer had been asleep at 3:47 in the morning. He lived alone. No one had access to his apartment. And yet there he was, captured in perfect clarity, examining photographs in a kitchen, illuminated by a light he did not remember turning on. The engineer disappeared that night. His apartment was found locked from the inside, his personal belongings undisturbed, his coffee maker still warm as if he had just stepped away for a moment. The only anomaly was the mirror in his bathroom. It had been shattered from the inside, fragments of glass scattered across the floor in a pattern that investigating officers struggled to explain. The shards pointed outward, away from the mirror's frame, as if something had pushed through from the other side rather than something striking the surface from within the room. No body was ever recovered. No evidence of foul play was ever established. The engineer's case was classified as a voluntary disappearance, another unexplained exit from a life that had become unbearable. But I obtained his personal journals from a storage auction last year, and what I found in those pages convinced me that his disappearance was anything but voluntary. In the weeks before he vanished, the engineer had become obsessed with understanding what he had witnessed at Ridgewood Memorial. He researched the hospital's history extensively, tracking down former employees, examining archived records, piecing together a timeline of incidents that spanned decades. What he discovered terrified him so completely that his final journal entries were written in a code that took me 3 months to decipher. Harold Crane, the doctor who vanished in 1943, had not simply gone to investigate strange sounds in the basement. He had been conducting experiments, unauthorized, undocumented experiments that drew on knowledge he had acquired during his medical training in Europe, knowledge that predated modern science by centuries. Harold had become convinced that death was not an ending but a transition, a passage between states of existence that could be observed, measured, and potentially controlled. The basement of Ridgewood Memorial, with its morgue and its proximity to so many departing souls, was the perfect laboratory for his research. The engineer's journals contained transcriptions of documents he had found in obscure archives, letters written by Harold Crane to colleagues in other countries, discussing his progress with a mixture of scientific detachment and barely contained excitement. Harold believed he had discovered something beneath the hospital, not created, discovered. a place where the boundary between living and dead grew thin enough to observe, thin enough to communicate through, thin enough to step across if one knew the proper methods. The chamber beneath the morgue was not Harold's creation. It was far older than the hospital, older than the town, older than any human settlement in the region. Harold had simply found it, excavated it, and begun using it for purposes that his letters never fully explained. His final correspondence, dated February 2, 1943, one day before his disappearance, contained a single sentence that the engineer had circled multiple times in red ink. "Tomorrow I will step through, and I will finally understand what waits on the other side." Harold Crane stepped through. Whatever waited on the other side was not what he expected, and whatever he became after that transition was not human in any meaningful sense. It wore his form. It carried his memories. It continued his work with patients who checked into Ridgewood Memorial, never suspecting that the kind doctor treating their ailments had not breathed, had not aged, had not truly been alive since a February night in 1943 when he descended into a chamber and allowed something else to take his place. This is what the engineer concluded from his research. This is what he believed had smiled at the search team from within that impossible mirror. And this is what he believed was sending him photographs, documenting his life the same way it had documented the lives of everyone who entered Ridgewood Memorial, adding pages to a collection that spanned decades, that filled rooms beneath the earth, that served purposes no living mind could comprehend. The photographs were not threats. They were not warnings. They were something far worse. They were cataloging. Whatever existed in that chamber was building an archive of human lives, recording every moment, every memory, every connection between souls, preparing for something that the engineer's journals could only describe as a gathering, a harvest, an invitation that would eventually be extended to everyone whose image hung on those underground walls. I mentioned earlier that 17 people have attempted to enter Ridgewood Memorial since its closure. What I did not tell you is that those 17 people had something in common beyond their curiosity about an abandoned hospital. Every single one of them had been patients at Ridgewood Memorial at some point in their lives. Every single one of them had stayed in room 147. And every single one of them, according to interviews with family members conducted after their disappearances, had been experiencing the same thing in the weeks before they tried to enter. They had been dreaming of hallways. They had been seeing faces in mirrors that were not their own. And they had been receiving photographs in their mail, photographs of themselves at ages they did not remember, in places they had never visited, standing beside a figure in a white coat whose face was always just outside the frame. 3 of those 17 people were recovered. I use the word recovered loosely because what was found bore only a superficial resemblance to the individuals who had breached the hospital's perimeter. They were discovered by the armed security teams that patrol Ridgewood Memorial every night, teams employed by a private contractor whose client list is classified and whose personnel sign non-disclosure agreements measured in decades rather than years. The first was a man named David Chen, 47 years old, a software engineer who had been treated for pneumonia at Ridgewood Memorial in 1984 as a teenager. His family reported him missing on a Tuesday evening. Security found him Thursday morning, sitting cross-legged on the hospital's front steps, facing the sealed entrance, his hands pressed flat against the concrete as if feeling for a heartbeat within the building. His eyes were open but unresponsive to light. His lips were moving in a continuous loop, forming words that the security team could not understand until they recorded him and played the audio at half speed. He was reciting names. Hundreds of names. Names that, when later cross-referenced against hospital records, matched patients who had died at Ridgewood Memorial between 1943 and 1987. He recited them in chronological order of their deaths, without error, without pause, without any indication of how a man who had spent 3 days in a room he should not have been able to access had acquired knowledge that existed only in sealed medical archives. David Chen was transferred to a psychiatric facility where he remained for 14 months before his family arranged his release into home care. He never recovered his ability to communicate normally. He could recite names and dates with mechanical precision, but he could not recognize his own wife, could not remember his children, could not perform basic tasks that he had mastered decades earlier. His mind had been emptied of everything personal and refilled with data from a hospital that should have had no claim on his consciousness. The second recovered individual was a woman named Sarah Park, 39, who had been born at Ridgewood Memorial in 1952. She was found inside the building itself, having somehow bypassed the concrete seals, the welded doors, and the security systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion. Security footage from exterior cameras showed her approaching the building at 3:47 in the morning, walking directly toward a section of wall that had no entrance, no window, no gap of any kind, and simply passing through it as if the concrete were not there. The footage was reviewed by 3 independent video analysts, none of whom could identify signs of editing, manipulation, or technical malfunction. Sarah Park walked through a solid concrete wall the way a living person walks through an open door. She was discovered 7 hours later in what the security team's incident report described as a room in the basement level that does not correspond to any known architectural feature of the building. She was standing in front of a mirror, motionless, her reflection performing actions that she herself was not performing. The security team lead, a former military operative with 20 years of experience in environments most people cannot imagine, included a personal note in his report that was later flagged for removal, but preserved in the copy I obtained. He wrote that what he saw in that mirror made him question every assumption he had ever held about the nature of reality. He wrote that Sarah Park's reflection was not alone. There were figures standing behind her in the mirror, dozens of them, all wearing hospital gowns, all facing the glass, all pressing their hands against the surface from the other side. And in the center of that crowd, taller than the rest, stood a man in a white coat whose face the security lead recognized from photographs he had been shown during his pre-assignment briefing. Harold Crane, smiling, waiting, patient as only the dead can be patient. Sarah Park was extracted and transferred to the same facility that had housed Linda Morrison years earlier. She exhibited identical symptoms: silence, unblinking eyes, an obsessive need to draw the same image over and over, but Sarah's drawings were different from Linda's. Where Linda had drawn a door, a hallway, and something waiting at the end, Sarah drew something far more disturbing. She drew the view from inside the mirror. She drew what the reflections saw when they looked out at the living world. She drew a hospital room seen through glass, and in every drawing, standing in that room, unaware of being observed, was a different person, a different patient, a different name on a list that something beneath Ridgewood Memorial was methodically working through. The third recovered individual is the one that keeps me awake at night, because the third individual was not a former patient. She was not someone who had ever set foot in Ridgewood Memorial during its years of operation. She was a 16-year-old girl named Emma Torres who had been born in 2003, 16 years after the hospital closed. She had no connection to the building, no family history linked to its patient records, no reason to seek it out. And yet on the night of September 12, 2019, she was found standing inside the sealed hospital, in room 147, staring at a wall where a mirror had once hung, speaking to someone who was not there. Emma was conscious when security found her. She was the only recovered individual who could communicate. And what she told the security team, what she repeated to the psychiatric professionals who evaluated her, what she eventually told me in a recorded interview that I have listened to more times than I can count, changed everything I thought I understood about Ridgewood Memorial Hospital. Emma said she had been invited. She said she had been receiving messages for months, not through mail, not through photographs, but through her phone. Text messages from a number that did not exist, containing images of a hospital she had never seen, descriptions of rooms she had never visited, and detailed instructions for how to enter a building that the entire world believed was sealed. The messages were signed with a name, Harold Crane, and they contained a promise that Emma found irresistible in the way that only a teenager struggling with loss and loneliness could find irresistible. Harold promised her that death was not permanent. He promised her that the people we lose are not gone. He promised her that behind every mirror in every room in every building on Earth, there is another version of reality where everyone who has ever died continues to exist, waiting for the living to find their way through. And he promised her that Ridgewood Memorial was the door, the only door. The place where the glass grows thin enough to step through, to join the ones we have lost, to escape the loneliness of being alive in a world that takes everyone we love. Emma did not step through. She told me she wanted to. She told me she stood in front of that wall and felt something pulling at her, felt hands that were not quite solid pressing against her skin, felt breath that carried no warmth against her neck. She told me she saw faces forming in the plaster where the mirror had once hung, faces she recognized, faces of people she had loved and lost. And she told me that the only reason she did not surrender to that pull, the only reason she turned away and screamed until security found her, was something she noticed about the faces in the wall. They were not at peace. They were not waiting contentedly for her to join them. Their mouths were open. Their eyes were wide, and their hands were not reaching toward her in welcome. They were pushing against the wall from the other side, trying to get out, trying to escape whatever existed behind the glass, trying to warn her that what Harold Crane offered was not reunion but consumption. Ridgewood Memorial Hospital stands today exactly as it has stood for 36 years. Sealed, guarded, silent. The fence has been reinforced twice. The security contract has been renewed without interruption since 1988. The concrete seals are inspected monthly by teams who arrive in unmarked vehicles and leave without speaking to anyone in the community. But the building is not empty. Every surveillance microphone planted around the perimeter picks up the same sounds, night after night, year after year. Footsteps packing through corridors that should contain nothing but dust and darkness. Digging beneath the foundation, rhythmic and persistent, growing louder each year. And voices. Thousands of voices whispering in unison at exactly 3:47 every morning, speaking words that analysts have finally decoded after decades of trying. The whispers say the same thing, over and over, in 12-minute cycles that never vary. We see you, we have always seen you, and the door is almost open. I do not know what exists beneath Ridgewood Memorial Hospital. I do not know if Harold Crane found a doorway between life and death, or if he became something else entirely in that chamber beneath the morgue. I do not know why certain people are drawn to that building against their will, or why mirrors seem to function as windows into a place that our science cannot acknowledge and our minds cannot safely comprehend. But I know the whispers are getting louder. I know the digging is getting closer to the surface. I know that Emma Torres still receives text messages from a number that does not exist, and the most recent one, received 3 nights ago, contained just 4 words. The door is open. If this story unsettled you, if you felt that cold recognition in your chest, if you found yourself glancing at the nearest mirror and wondering what might be looking back, then you understand why I do this work. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because there are more places like Ridgewood Memorial out there. More sealed buildings, more impossible rooms, more doors that should never be opened, and I intend to find every single one of them. But tonight, before you sleep, do me one small favor. Walk past the mirror in your bathroom. Do not look into it. Do not stop. Just walk past and listen carefully. Because if you hear breathing that is not your own, you will know that the door is closer than you think.